All right, now let's go through some of our render settings that we have. I'm going to go into my render settings menu here. And we've talked about this before, but there's a standard way to render your stuff. Okay, so these are standard settings, like kind of nuts and bolts, very basic stuff. Lower resolution, you can think of it, lower quality. And then there's physical, which is a higher quality rendering if you're using those settings. So let's just take a look at standard real quick, and I believe I have everything turned off. That's, would take a long time. So sometimes the standard rendering is going to be perfectly fine. You can get away with using that standard renderer. But let's look at some of the options that we would have here. Okay, output is always going to be the same. What is the size of your output that you're sending your stuff out at? So if this is a movie, you may have it at these settings. If it's a portrait, you'll have it at different settings. If it's a whatever, you'll have different settings in there. So you have to know what your output is, what your end resolution is, so you can punch those in. These are the only numbers you really need to change in this top spot here. The rest of this will just, that should all come into it. As long as you haven't screwed with anything, it should be fine. The frame rate is 30, that's standard for what we're doing. And then frame range, if we're doing an animation, we have to tell it where's our start frame and what is our end frame. In this case, I'm doing 1 to 120. I could also say all frames, and it'll do the start of this, which is actually 0 to 120. Okay, so 0 to 120. Under save, this is where it wants us to save our stuff. So I would go into here and tell it, okay, I'm going to go into my renders folder and give this a name. Always put your name on there and always give it a name of what it is. So in this case, I'm just going to say objects. TIFF is a perfectly fine way to export our stuff. We won't get any crazy compression. 8 bits is fine for this. And then our name, we always need to choose this bottom one, name.number.extension. It's fine clicking the alpha channel. If you don't use it, you don't need to use it. You can just not use it. But if you don't, then you won't have it on there. So typically I like to click that as well. Multipass we're not going to get into initially. Anti-aliasing is where we need to set the quality. So as I zoom in on some of these things, we might see some kind of graininess or bumpiness happening around the edges. So on that anti-aliasing, I can change this to best anti-aliasing. And then if I change my filter here to whether it's a cubic or animation, typically I just set this to Mitchell. Okay. Now the change in this will be subtle, but it'll definitely be better than it was without it. It's still thinking. Oh, it's actually going through and rendering each frame. That's what it's doing now, because I hit Shift R. So let's go here. And we can see the edges are a little bit softer. If I take this anti-aliasing to geometry, and let's just render that out and see. Oops. I'm going to set my output. Sometimes you have to jump back and forth. So I'm going to set this as just current frame. Just need the one frame. So I'm rendering out the one frame. Oh, there it is. Okay, not a huge difference in this one, but we definitely see it in other pieces. Okay, this is going to control what those edges look like. Okay, or I guess we could set it to none and really see what it looks like. There we go. You can see what none looks like, just pretty horrible, just really choppy, blocky stuff. And then taking that to best. And then 4x4 is good. You can take it up higher if you had higher geometry, but 4x4 is typically good, and setting that to Mitchell. Options, we don't need to worry about anything really in here. And that's it. Okay, so that would be it for standard. Okay, so if we're rendering something with standard, we set up our resolution, make sure this is on all frames. We hit Shift R, and then away it goes. So now it's rendering frame 1, then frame 2, then frame 3, and so on. We can hit Escape and just stop it. And if it renders the wrong camera, obviously that's something we would adjust just by making sure that we've clicked on the right camera. Maybe we'll middle click just to verify, and then hit Shift R, and then it should render the right camera through that. Let's go back to our render settings. If we had physical, this is where we have some other options. So obviously we have depth of field. We also have motion blur. So if we had something that was moving very quickly, we may want motion blur on there so we get the blurriness of it. These are our subdivisions, so the more of these we have, the smoother it'll be. Typically with physical, we choose depth of field when we want it, we choose motion blur when we want it. But this sampler is where we, sampling quality is where we would set this to high, and we would get a very smoothed out rendering. So if I make sure this is set to only frame 1 for now, or the current frame, and render this out, this is going to take a little bit longer to render, but typically we're going to have a smoother rendering. I'm going to delete all this other stuff that I have here. I don't need that. There it is. Okay, so here's what it looked like in anti-aliasing. You can see physical, we get obviously a much smoother rendering that we would have. Okay, but it's going to take longer to render out, so it's a trade-off. Some things, obviously, if we want a motion blur depth of field, we have to have this. There's no way around that. You have to have depth of field or motion blur on the scene. And then there's other renderers that you could add to this list. You could download, buy, whatever. But for cinema, for this class, we are only going to be using these 2 basic ones to start off. Okay, so I'm going to hit escape. And then I'm going to go to my, not render settings. I'm going to go to render here. I'm going to go to render queue. Okay, so I'm going to say, instead of doing the Shift R, I'm going to say add to render queue. Say yes. Let's go ahead and save that. And what this does is, instead of me, let's say I had all 4 of these cameras, 5 of these cameras I want to render out. If I did the Shift R, I have to switch to each one of these cameras and hit Shift R. After one gets done, then I do the other one. Another one gets done, I do the other one. With the render queue, I could actually add this camera in there and say, which settings do you want to use? I want to use physical, and I want to use render cam. And then I can come up here and duplicate this. Oops. Job. I can add it again, but I'm just seeing if there's a duplicate. I thought there was. No? Yes. Nope. All right, so I'll just add another one. Render, add to render queue. There we go. There's the second one. And then I could say do rotate cam. And then I would pick where my output files are going to go. So what do you want them to be called? So Sarcona objects, it automatically named it I1, and this one is just nothing. Okay, so I may want to call this one Sarcona render cam. There we go. It's going to automatically add that one on there, and this is the Sarcona objects, which I'll get rid of the objects and say rotate cam. Get rid of all those extra whatever's on the end. Rotate cam. There we go. And then when I'm ready to go, I just click that, and it goes through and it'll render out all of these, whatever my render settings are set to. Make sure it's set to all frames. Hit play, it'll render all of these frames, put them in that folder, render all these frames, put them in that folder. Okay? And then that's it. That's how you render from Maya, or from Cinema.